Morning. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting us to participate. This is a really, really important community conversation, so I'm glad to participate.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for having us. We look forward to presenting some of our information and answering a lot of your questions and having some real great interaction and engagement as we talk today. So with that, we thought we would start with an overview of who we are. So I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you. So I work at the Domestic Violence Action Center. Last year, we celebrated our 30th anniversary of servant leadership to the community. We've grown from a two-person staff to just about 50 of us working in a variety of different kinds of ways to serve survivors and island families and the community as a whole, to increase understanding about the complexity of domestic violence and the ways in which it touches all of us. There's still some misconceptions about the problem of domestic violence, that this only occurs to certain kinds of families in certain kinds of neighborhoods or certain kinds of socioeconomic classes. What we find is that domestic violence does not discriminate. And so we've built an array of programs in response to what we have learned as an agency devoted to addressing the problem. So we have a helpline, which was our first program service. It began with volunteers over the lunch hour. Quickly, we learned that that was not going to be sufficient, and we opened a very small office with 2 people. Currently, we have helpline telephone during the workday work week. And at the onset of the pandemic, we added text and chat features. So we are available to the community 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by text and by chat. We have a team of attorneys who assist survivors in family court actions. They carry a complex and potentially lethal caseload of divorce, restraining order, paternity, and post-decree cases. So those would be cases where the person already has a court order, but for one reason or another, it's not working well. So we'll help them go back to court and make it be a better tool for them to either have their rights protected or their safety protected. We have staff on site at court, both in Kapolei and Circuit Court, where people are able to petition the family court for restraining orders. It's a very challenging process. It's an enormous decision to make for a person. And so there's an element of fear and uncertainty about what to expect. So we have staff on site there to answer questions, to provide safety planning, to accompany people into the courtroom, to explain what they might expect with the process. It's very, very helpful. The feedback that we get from survivors who have had the opportunity to interact with our Expo team are just so grateful because it's an unfamiliar language and it's a very unfamiliar system to most people. We also have a program called TAP 808, which is our Teen Alert program. And that work is to help young people understand the parameters of a healthy relationship, understand what red flags might be. And we have an advocate on as part of that program who works with people, young people who are already experiencing dating violence. So that's a statewide program, and we go to intermediate and high schools, and we work with youth serving organizations on Oahu and neighbor islands. Pulama Ika Ohana is a program that was designed to work with children who live in violent homes, children witnesses or children exposed to domestic violence, and their non-offending parents. So there's support groups and advocacy. There's groups for both the adults and the children by age level, so that the work that's being facilitated for moms is similar to the work offered to children at the same time. So if they go home or when they go home after group, they're able to share or explore some of the issues that we worked with at support group. Ho'oi Kaika Ohana is our program that is designed and devoted to serving Native Hawaiian families. The program was really devised and dreamed up by a community hui of cultural practitioners, content experts, survivors, to generate a program that was responsive to Native Hawaiian values and the sense of place that is often overlooked in community. We have worked since the beginning on a men's march. It's a very big public initiative to engage men. We see men as allies in our work addressing domestic violence, and we need them to stand by us in taking responsibility for addressing the issue, speaking about the issue. And so the Men's March is one way they can do that. We understood from the very beginning that our program services really needed to mirror the community that we're serving. And so we have on staff specialized advocates, Korean advocate, Filipina advocate, KOFA advocate, Japanese advocate, LGBTQ advocate, Native Hawaiian advocate, so that when a person comes for help, they are welcomed and supported by somebody who looks like them and speaks their language. Our most recent addition to our array of programs is housing. We have, been allies and observers of the community conversation about houselessness for the last 10 years or so, and became increasingly more troubled that the conversation left out survivors of domestic violence who have either fled or escaped from domestic violence households or homes where domestic violence was occurring, and not being considered in the community's approach to addressing houselessness. Many, about 80% of our clients, when we meet them, describe housing as an issue and a need that they need assistance with. So we are currently operating permanent supportive housing for survivors and their children. I guess the other thing that we take very seriously in our commitment to addressing domestic violence is our participation in committees, task forces, working groups. We want to be at the table when the problem of domestic violence is not being spoken about unless we're at the table. So we participate in a lot of committees or councils that are appointed either by the governor, the chief justice, or the mayor, or city council, legislature. And we find that to be very important. For example, one of the committees we sit on is the Domestic Violence Fatality Review. And that is multidisciplinary team that looks at domestic violence homicides to understand in what ways the system was not responsive or effective in assisting somebody who has suffered the harm of domestic violence and ultimately died as a result of domestic violence. So that's just an overview of our community's programs. We also take very seriously our role in educating the community. We don't decline any invitations to speak to our community about the problem of domestic violence. We long ago understood that the problem of domestic violence is way bigger than we are, and we need the collaboration of all sectors in the community to work with us and to understand how domestic violence might show up in their workplace or in their community or their neighborhood or their church or their school or their healthcare setting. So we like to bring ourselves and our information and our message to all sectors of the community. So we're grateful to be here this morning.
Great, thanks, Nancy. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the Arcadia family of companies and what we do. But before that, Nancy and I would love for you, if you can, we want this to be interactive and we know we can't talk to you. So we wanted to use chat. And if you could just type in the chat what you do, what is your role? Are you a caregiver? Are you a professional in the industry? We'd just like to know who the audience is. So if you can do that, we'd love to see who's on the call with us. With that, I'm Susie Schulberg. I have been with the Arcadia family of companies for going on 20 years this year. Arcadia was founded back in 1967. We are a senior living organization, and we have grown from one retirement community on Punahou Street. That is kitty corner from Kapiolani Medical Center right next to Maryknoll High School. We've grown from one community to a family of 8 nonprofit organizations over the last 55 years. And this slide gives you an idea of what types of services we provide. So we provide 2 life plan communities. These are Arcadia and 15 Craigside. We serve in both of those communities a little over 500 kupuna at all times. And these life plan communities offer independent living, assisted living, and then long-term care, skilled nursing, intermediate care. We've also gone out into home and community-based programs. And so we have had, for the last 20 years, we've had a home care and home health agency that goes out into the community to provide services to kupuna in their home. We also have an adult daycare and day health center located at Central Union Church that provides service to about 60 to 65 kupuna each day, Monday through Friday. We also have a foundation and what we call Arcadia at Home, which is, it's like a retirement community, but at home. So you get to live at home while enjoying the benefits of coming to either Arcadia and 15 Craigside whenever you like. So that kind of gives you the overview of our family of companies. We serve just over 900 kupuna daily, each and every day. And we have a staff of about 560 employees that we have on board with us. And, you know, the question of the day that we're looking at is domestic violence and caregiving. Is there a connection? And I think that they're intertwined. And so throughout the course of this presentation, I hope that both Nancy and myself are able to share with you, you know, kind of what the issues are, but also hopefully some tips, because in planning this session, you know, Nancy said one thing that really has resonated with me is that this is, as a community, we need to work together to make sure we protect one another. And so I think that we're going to be able to provide some tips, maybe dispel some myths on what this looks like as we move forward. And so thank you all very much for putting in the chat. We see that, yes, we have a caregiver for your mom. Excellent. Previous co-family caregiver for mother who was passed in 2019. I'm so sorry. And then comparing her care and resources back then compared to the current resources now. Funny you should say that. We've had a pandemic between 2019 and now, so a lot of things have changed and hopefully a lot more resources that we can provide you. So with that, I hope that gives you an overview of both of us. And let's just jump right into what the issues might be. And Nancy, if okay with you, I'm going to turn it over to you to really look at dispelling this myth that stress causes domestic violence. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. We often are asked the question, or it is pointed out to us that during particular times in a person's life or over the past 2 years, when we're all experiencing so much uncertainty, that the stress was a reason people might resort to abuse. We really feel it's important to remind people that all of us experienced stress, and not all of us resort to violence as a way of responding to the stress that we are experiencing. So it's important that we distinguish stress as a variable that all of us live with daily, and each one of us has to develop our own coping mechanisms. So it is not an explanation for domestic violence. Of course, abusers, batterers experience stress, but so do I. People often asked us over the course of the pandemic, God, domestic violence must have gone up. There was so much stress. And I reminded people that, of course, we were all under stress. My husband didn't turn into a domestic violence abuser during the course of the pandemic or the stress that we were all living with. So it's really important that we understand, we're not going to have time necessarily today unless there are specific questions about it. What are the root causes of domestic violence? But stress is not one of them. So it's important that we set that aside when we're trying to understand what is domestic violence and what we as a community can do to address the domestic violence. In relationships where there is domestic violence, even when the stress is reduced, the domestic violence, we're going to talk about the power and control wheel in a moment, but even when the stress is reduced, the violence will resume because the person in the relationship who holds the power and wields that power to maintain control over their partner will resort to various tactics. I want, before I say one more thing, offer a disclaimer. For the time that we're together, I am going to be referring to victims and survivors as she and perpetrators as he, simply for ease of discussion. This does not mean that we don't believe or don't serve men, because we do. Men can be abused, as can women. The vast majority of the people we serve at the Domestic Violence Action Center, the vast majority of the people who report instances of abuse are female. So I'll refer to victims and survivors as she, and batterers or abusers as he. All of our community's domestic violence programs, Domestic Violence Action Center, Child and Family Service, Parents and Children Together, do serve men who are victims. All of us do an assessment to make sure we're providing the right services to in the right way to the real victim or the real survivor. We use the term survivor because she has overcome many, many barriers and survived many, many things. So we use the term survivor rather than victim. So I think maybe we.
So now,
yeah, go ahead.
Would it be a good time now for Debbie to do the poll?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, Debbie, go for it. So if you guys can, I guess, answer the question that you see in the poll, and we will see what your responses are. I think one thing, I'm having a problem here with all of this chat function. Okay, let's put this away. Sorry. What we wanted to do is, once the poll closes, is we wanted to do a little interactive exercise, and you're going to have to do it through the chat. So I'm thinking maybe Nancy, if you can read the chat and shout it out, and then I am going to type on this slide what you guys see as challenges. We have a number, at least 2 folks who said that they were caregivers now and former caregivers. What is it that are your challenges? And this is going to kind of be a primer for next. Nancy's going to talk about that power and control wheel. And so how are we doing on the poll, Debbie?
I'll go ahead and end the poll, and I'll share the results right now.
Okay, perfect. And so in the chat, if you can just, let's see, have you experienced challenges as a caregiver? 67% yes, so that's 4 out of 6 people, and 2 out of 6 no. Great, okay, so little 60-30 there. What we wanted to do now is, if you can in the chat, tell us what are some of those, I'm gonna get out of the PowerPoint here, and just tell us what are some of the challenges that you have been experiencing as caregivers. I can prime it a little bit as you're putting these together. You know, some of the experiences that caregivers experience isolation. Isolation is a big one. Stress is also another big challenge. Any others, Nancy, that are coming up in the chat?
I don't see any in the chat. Are we having our participants respond in chat or Q&A, Deb?
In the chat.
Okay. Trying to understand what mom is thinking so I can be better at care. I would offer maybe impatience. Burnout.
One that I find interesting is sleep deprivation.
I was just going to say fatigue.
Yep,
Yeah.
fatigue, put fatigue.
Mhm.
What about financial burden? That's one that we see quite a bit, is how maybe you're a caregiver who is a family caregiver and it's just too much, but you're kind of strapped because maybe you might not be able to afford a paid caregiver. What are the options out there and what can I do to reduce that stress? Any other? Go ahead.
The sense that caregivers assume that the caregiver is at the beck and call at all times, that there's sort of no hold bars, no boundaries, no ways to set boundaries because the expectation is that you're always going to be there and you're always going to be available.
One that I'd like to offer is just being afraid to ask for help.
I think too, initially when people begin providing care to others, they're teaching themselves what's necessary, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. Not sure all that you have to consider, think about, manage, handle, respond to. I'm going to stronger personality of other caregiver whose decision-making is not always beneficial to the well-being of the person being cared for, the patient. Maybe it's not even always proper or beneficial. Excuse me. Thank you for typing your speed typer. Yeah, the negotiation that has to occur between caregivers, whether they're family members or family members and outside caregivers, can sometimes be arduous.
Any other last challenges that anyone would like to share? I think we got a pretty good list here. And it's pretty inclusive.
We've got a great list there.
Great. Okay, so with that, let me go back to this screen. So here we have what we've come up with as a group: isolation, stress, trying to understand what mom is thinking so I can better provide care, better at care. This is also just pointing out to this one, yes, because mom might not be able to communicate. She might have difficulties doing that. So how do I find ways that I can understand what she's saying and how she's feeling? Impatience, burnout, fatigue, financial burden, the sense that caregivers assume that the caregiver is at the beck and call all the time. There's no way, there's no way to set boundaries because you should always be available. Being afraid to ask for help. When you begin to provide care, people are teaching themselves You're not sure how to handle everything. Are there ways? Are there support groups? Are there tutorials on how to do this? What's out there? Stronger personality of other caregiver whose decisions or personality might not benefit the kapuna. And then just negotiation with the care team, and that care team being both outside caregivers as well as family caregivers, how to coordinate that effort. So definitely we have a really comprehensive list here of the challenges that caregivers face. And it's caregivers, whether they are family unpaid caregivers, or even if they are paid caregivers from an organization. So with that, I want to hand it back over now to Nancy, who is going to talk about a very important graphic right here, the power and control wheel. And Nancy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, the transition is kind of harsh. We listed a lot of very important observations and characteristics of the role. We don't really have any answers for you, but we wanted to validate that caregiving, as you well know, is very, very challenging. And I don't think that the community as a whole has a clear understanding of what that role is or what the burden is. Even when it's done with love and intention, it still can be a burden, or ultimately becomes a burden. With, excuse me, what starts out as maybe a simple way of caring for somebody over time can become much more complicated and consuming. Excuse me. Let me just take a quick drink here. Thank you. When we talk about domestic violence and we think about the problem of domestic violence, people generally assume we mean only physical and sexual acts of assault or the use of force. As you can see on the power and control wheel, the physical and sexual violence is the bold behavior that holds the rest of it together. The power and control wheel was designed by a domestic violence program probably about 25 years ago in Duluth, Minnesota. They wanted to get a clearer understanding of what the people they were helping, what they were experiencing. And they listened to all of the participants in their support groups and devised this tool that has now been adopted internationally as a way of understanding what ways people will use power to control their partner. So I'm just going to very briefly go around the power and control wheel. And in your role as a caregiver or as a family member, you may see some of this going on that you weren't able to label before. So using intimidation, people may be throwing things. They may not hit anybody, but they may throw things, or they may throw something at the wall nearby where the person is standing, with the implied threat that you could be next. Maybe they're destroying personal property or sentimental property of people in the family or of their partner, which is a way of saying, I have control over your possessions. Maybe they're displaying weapons. Maybe they haven't used them, but maybe they're cleaning a firearm in the presence of a family member, which can be very, very frightening and very intimidating. Certainly emotional abuse is a tactic that people use to control others. Maybe they're name calling or degrading them, or playing mind games, making the people, the partner feel that they're exaggerating or they're making something up, or changing the facts of circumstance to become confusing for the person who experienced it, without the ability to challenge it, because it's not safe to challenge their abusive partner. Isolation, Susie mentioned isolation of caregivers, and that's true in relationships where there's domestic violence going on as well. People who have power and want to maintain that power either prevent, prohibit, or restrict their partner's contact with other people, their communication with other people. So they don't allow telephone contact or personal contact. Maybe they prevent them from going to family events or spending time with their friends, or even going to work-related events or occasions. There's quite a bit of minimizing and denying going on in relationships where there is abuse. The abuser will minimize the seriousness of what's occurring, and sometimes the survivor will too. It's very frightening to come face to face with what you're living with and maybe the potential risk that you're living with. And so you may tend to minimize its seriousness as a way of coping. The abuser may be denying that anything is awry or blaming her for causing him to resort to abuse. If you didn't do that, I wouldn't have to do this. And sometimes the survivor takes responsibility. If I were a better wife, or I were a better mother, or I were a better partner, or I were a better caregiver, I wouldn't be facing this wrath or this threat from my partner. Using children is very common. It's tied to making threats, which is on the top of the power and control wheel. If you leave me, you'll never see the kids again. Maybe withholding the children, maybe there's a visitation schedule and they are not returning the children on time, or they're violating the conditions of the agreement, whether it's a court order or a family agreement about the children. Maybe they're using the children to relay messages to their mom. We still live in a society where men play and hold dominant roles and power, and women are more likely sort of second class. So sometimes men will use the privilege of the domination that they can wield, and that's permitted and condoned by many of our cultures. You've certainly heard the phrase, he's the king of his castle. That's kind of captures the idea. Using economic abuse is also very, very common. Maybe she doesn't have access to the bank account. Maybe all of the family's assets are in his name. Maybe he gives her an allowance. Maybe she turns over her paycheck if he permits her to work to him. Maybe he gives her a certain amount of money or permits her to spend a certain amount of money on food for the family, and manages the receipts, or reviews the receipts to make sure that's what she's spent the money on. And using coercion and threats is sort of an underlying way of always communicating to the partner that if you don't cooperate, or you don't concede, or you don't accommodate, there's a bigger threat right behind my direction or my insistence or my expectation. And that's why the physical and sexual violence is the glue that holds it all together, because she clearly understands if she is not cooperating and she is not conceding, that he can always resort to physical and sexual violence again, or for the first time. Sometimes we get survivors calling us and describing many of these tactics and say, you know, I haven't ever been hit. My husband or my boyfriend has never hit me. My partner has never hit me. I'm not sure if I'm a victim of abuse. And then they describe many of these things, and we say these are legitimate tactics by one person to control another. So yes, we see you as a survivor of domestic abuse. I just wanted to, this is a lot of information and I went through it very, very fast, but I wanted to just pause for a moment and see if anybody has any specific questions about the power and control wheel that I might be able to answer before we move on and sort of tie it back into your role as a caregiver in ways that you may observe some of these tactics in play when you go to the home of the person you're caring for.
And while you're typing your your question in the chat, I think this is a perfect segue. With the power and control wheel, there are crossovers between with what we see as the 7 specific types of abuse for kupuna. And so when we think of those 7 different types, we're talking about verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, neglect, misappropriation of funds, and what we call involuntary seclusion. So there's a lot of commonalities with what Nancy has just described on the wheel, and then the different types of abuse that caregivers and kupuna come into contact with. Did we get anything in the chat? Any questions, Nancy? No, okay. All right, so how do I do this? So in looking at what are the unique opportunities ahead, healthcare worker, whether it be a paid or unpaid caregiver, in your home, when you're caring for a loved one, you are in a unique position with opportunity. Looking for those signs of abuse, what could they be? And, you could be a caregiver that doesn't necessarily realize that maybe you're doing something that is adversely impacting the person that you're caring for. So some of those signs of abuse would be depression. Your loved one is confused or they're withdrawn. They're isolated from friends and family. They have unexplained bruises or scars or burns. They appear dirty. They appear dehydrated. They're over medicated or they're under medicated. There's medical problems. It can even go so far as to having pressure ulcers from not getting up and moving around. So those types of things are things to be aware of, whether you have a paid caregiver coming into the home and maybe they're not providing care to the quality that you want. Or it could be unintentional on a family caregiver because there are so many challenges and there is a lot of stress, going back to the caregiver challenges that we identified earlier. So, the unique position that we're in is something that we like to say in our organization is that if you see something, say something. If you've got something that you're noticing, let's talk about it. If it's in the section of you have a paid caregiver coming into the home, definitely make sure that you are communicating with that organization to let them know that you're seeing something. If it's you have a family member who is caring for the kupuna in your home, making sure that you identify it and talk with their support groups. There's organizations, which I'll talk about in a minute, that you can talk with on how do I approach these sensitive conversations if I fear and suspect that there is some type of violence or abuse or neglect going on. But really, as we said in the beginning, that abuse of any kind, it's an issue that the entire community has a responsibility to pay attention to. And as we were planning for this, one of the examples that Nancy and I came up with that was not in the mainstream that you would think of when you think of elder abuse or domestic violence together, is that maybe you have you're a caregiver who is going into a home to care for a kupuna, and you develop a great relationship with the daughter, who's your primary person that you're working with to coordinate services, keep them in the loop on what's happening with their loved one. And you notice that maybe the daughter, who is your point of contact, is exhibiting these types of signs and symptoms of abuse. What do you do? How can we prep a caregiver to make sure that, it's not, oh, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm only focusing on the kupuna that I'm taking care of. But, where it's the ohana, it's how do I see, okay, maybe the daughter might be experiencing something. How do I, as the caregiver, have that conversation or let my organization know so that we can help maybe to provide services and provide a point of contact for her so that she can get help as well. I don't know, Nancy, did you want to comment on anything with respect to that, if that would be a situation that folks would come into contact with?
Yeah, I would love to reinforce what you have just shared. It is not unlikely that if you are a caregiver going into a home and you're supporting a family, and your contact is, let's say, the daughter or the child or the adult child of the person, the elder, you may not even be exactly looking for signs, but you may detect certain things. And we want to say to you, if you are, it is an incredibly important opportunity that you have and that she has, having you be present, where if she is suffering isolation or fear or intimidation from her partner, having you nearby may be an avenue for her to explore options, safe routes to escape. I know this all sounds so catastrophic, but if a person is isolated and you are the caregiver going into a home and you notice something, you may be able to provide her just simply a telephone number or a resource that she could use. You, of course, would want to speak to her privately, not within earshot of anybody else. We develop safety plans for all the survivors that we interact with. And caregivers in these instances may also need a safety plan as well. Because if you are entering a home where there is domestic violence, it's not impossible to imagine that you could be a target of some act of violence, or you could be an observer to an act of violence. These are not easy conversations to have, but if you are noting certain red flags, or you have an intuitive sense that something is occurring that no one has spoken about, of course, you may want to just approach the daughter or the family member and just in a very loving way say, I'm concerned about your safety. Is this something that you're able to talk with me about? I'll tell you some examples of things that I have observed that make me concerned for your safety. You don't have to be an expert about domestic violence. All you are going to be is a bridge and a resource. If you're having the conversation, that delicate conversation, we want you to know that we're here to provide the expertise that that family member may need and may benefit from. So please don't let that be a barrier for you in having the conversation, even though it's delicate. The safety plan might be just a phrase that you can introduce to her when saying, I'm a little concerned about your safety. I understand there's something called a safety plan that you may want to develop for yourself in case you're in danger, or your mom is in more danger than she appears to be right now, or your dad, whoever it is that is the elder receiving care. And we can help them develop the safety plan. But if you use that phrase, that may give her, it may sort of turn a light on for her to think about, a safety plan would be a good thing. Now, a safety plan is something that we like to have people think through before they're in a crisis, because when we're in a crisis, it's very hard to think, okay, who do I call? What do I bring? What do I need? Where do I go? If you have thought through in advance who I might call, do I have a bag packed? Do I have the documents duplicated that I might need if I'm going to leave home? Do I have a spare key? Do I have $20 in my wallet? When a threat is presented, the person can just execute the safety plan rather than try to figure out what am I going to do in this moment. So that's why we encourage people to think about a safety plan. And for the caregiver, I would suggest the same thing. Don't be in a place in the house where you can be cornered. Don't be in the kitchen where there are knives. I mean, this would be true for the survivor's safety plan as well. But things that you might not have thought of, but you're aware that there's some element of risk or threat in the household. And obviously people aren't talking openly about this. So this would be just something that, since we've had this conversation now, you have a sense that there's a variety of things that could be going on, or things that you may overhear, or things that you may hear directly in terms of his direction to her about how much money she can spend when she goes out shopping for the family, if you're in the household while some of these conversations are going on. Each family doesn't look the same. The clusters of things that are on the power and control wheel are different. in different families. It's not kind of a formula or recipe that all families suffer the same kinds of abuse or the same kinds of tactics. So there might be 3 or 4 things on that safety plan, or 2 or 3 things, but enough to get you thinking, something going on here. I think I'm going to work myself up to the courage to have a conversation. And you know what? You could call us in advance and say, this is what I'm experiencing. Can you help me figure out how to best approach the conversation? We get lots of calls on our helpline from businesses with a supervisor saying, I've got an employee in my office and she's experiencing domestic violence. I don't really know what to say to her. Can you give me some guidance? We get a lot of calls from healthcare practitioners who say, I've got somebody in my exam room who's describing living with an abusive partner, and I don't know what the best thing to advise her is. Can you give me some suggestions? So we're available to you as well to provide support and guidance and answer any questions that you may have in the houses or the homes that you're supporting.
And I think to dovetail in with that, are there resources that are available to folks who might be the primary caregiver, and it's a family caregiver? So maybe it's whether you're caring for your mom or your father or your husband or your wife. You know, there are many different support nets that are out there, and organizations that can provide great information and point you in the right direction. A few of them, Catholic Charities is one, the Executive Office on Aging is another. That is where the Ombudsman is housed. The Ombudsman, John McDermott, is a great resource. If you're not sure, just give him a call and he can point you in the right direction. Kokua Mau is another great organization that helps to provide resources. I will say Adult Protective Services, that within our industry, long-term care industry, senior industry, that is our reporting agency. I'll leave it at that. Report it to APS, you know, how things go, you'll have to see. They have a lot of cases that come through. So you just, you know, the important thing to remember is that if you suspect something, and whether it's self-reporting or reporting something that you're seeing, you don't have to have all the answers. Like Nancy said, you don't have to, honestly, you don't even have to have observed something. If you have a feeling, if you've seen something that is on the person's body or you've not seen it happen to them, go ahead and report it. Always be safe and make sure that if we see something, we say something. I think at this point, let's see, go to the next slide. I think, Debbie, we only have like 9 minutes left. So we wanted to kind of wrap up. Here is the contact information for Nancy and myself. Nancy's the main helpline, as well as the text number that she had mentioned. And then the website, is that right, Nancy? Good to go? Okay, and then if Arcadia Family of Companies can be any help as a resource, there's our contact information and our website.